You're looking great this morning. What I want to talk about this morning is hopes and fears. Fears and hopes. I wish I knew what your hopes and fears were, but of course I don't. So all I can do is tell you about my hopes and fears and see if they correspond to yours in any way at all. Let me start with the fears, so at least we'll end up on a positive note. And then I'll tell you about the hopes, which is a nice thing to talk about in Varna on a sunny Sunday morning. So the fears. For as long as I can remember, I go to bed at night worried. There are so many things to worry about in the world today, aren't there? Every time you go to a website or you pick up a newspaper, you discover something else that seems to be going horribly, horribly wrong. And partly this is an illusion, because as we grow older, we are always convinced, as every generation before us has been convinced, that things are getting worse. But partly it's also true. In many ways, things are getting worse, because we live in a massively interconnected world. Globalization ensures that all of our problems get passed around the planet very quickly, and they tend to multiply. So I go to bed at night worrying, of course, about climate change. I guess most of us do, unless those of us who conveniently decide not to believe in it, in which case we don't have to worry and life is much easier. I go to bed at night worrying about conflict. It seems that conflicts are multiplying. In some ways they are. It depends which statistics you look at. I go to bed at night worrying about the global problems of economic instability, general chaos and turmoil. I worry about terrorism. I worry about intolerance. I worry about racism. I worry about human rights and women's rights and children's rights and poverty and inequality and pandemics and landmines. And I worry so much I can't sleep anymore. Do you know what I mean? There seem to be so many of these problems. And the last thought I have before I go to bed at night, having worried for 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes about these things, is what can I do? And the phrase that goes round and round in my head is something like this: little old me, great big world. Great big world, little old me, what can I do? Is it literally nothing? Now, if you're like me, you've probably tried to do something about it, even though you're very small and the world is very big. And you've probably contributed money and signatures to petitions, to activist groups, to campaigning organizations, to charities, to NGOs, because they've promised something to you. They've said, give us your money, give us your signature, and we'll fix poverty. We'll fix starvation. We'll fix disease. We'll fix climate change. But if you're like me, over the years, you've begun to lose hope a little bit in some of these organizations, because they're very good at making a noise, but so far they haven't showed that they're very good at making a difference. And lots of people I talk to say this. They say, I've given so much to these organizations, but I don't feel that it's really helping. Okay, so those are the fears, and it's a pretty depressing prospect, and I admit that I do get depressed about it, and maybe you do too. Let me talk to you a little bit about hopes. This may sound like a completely different topic, but it's not. The two things are related. And it starts when I was growing up. When I was growing up, for some reason that I can't explain, I was always more interested in other countries than in my own country. I come from the United Kingdom. It's a moderately interesting country. It's about as interesting as every other country on the planet. Very interesting, really. Countries are interesting and people are interesting, and yet I was more interested in people who came from other countries, and I was more interested in other countries. I always thought that other countries were going to be more interesting, more beautiful, more exotic than my own country, and I wanted to travel. I wanted to discover other cultures. I wanted to learn other languages. I wanted to eat other people's food and listen to their music. I wanted to sing their songs with them. I wanted to find out about the rest of the world. And from as early as I can remember, the people that I liked mixing with were always the people who were most different from me. And you know, I assumed that everybody was the same. But then gradually, as I started to grow up, I began to discover that everybody wasn't the same. And actually, most of the people I met were almost the opposite, that they were less interested in people from other countries. Sure, they wanted to travel, but they thought that if somebody came from a different culture or a different religion, then they'd be less interesting than somebody from their own culture or their own religion. And I began to start to feel quite lonely and quite isolated. I thought to myself, does nobody see the world the way I do? And as I grew up, I became more and more interested in this, and I started to collect people. And I collected people who saw the world the same way as I did. And I began to try and study the differences. And if anybody ever said to me, "Where are you from?" I always had difficulty answering that question. It seemed like such an odd question. I would say, well, I was born in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, as far as I can remember. But where am I from? I'm from the world, right? And they would say, yeah, but what nationality are you? And I would say, well, on my passport it says I'm from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but I think I'm a member of the human race. I'm a human being. I'm a carbon-based life form, just like you are. Why are you asking this bizarre question about what it says on my passport? And I always had this feeling that I was a citizen of humanity first and a citizen of my own nation ninth or 15th. And there weren't very many other people who seemed to feel that way. And gradually, as I grew up, I had these two things, like a balance in my mind, although not a very comfortable balance. My fears about the way the world was going, and my hopes for how the world might be. And eventually it came to the point where I felt I really, really did have to try and do something about it. Because I used to have this job where I advised governments. I advised the presidents and prime ministers of countries all over the world on how they could engage more effectively with other countries, with the international community. And I discovered that a lot of them were not like me. A lot of them were really only interested in their own country and what they could do for their own people, which is natural. America first, Bulgaria first, France first, Guatemala first, Iceland first, Kenya first, the Isle of Man first. This is what politicians have always said since the beginning of time, and it's natural and it's normal. Let me say it now, and I'll say it again. There's nothing wrong with nationalism. There's nothing wrong with patriotism. Loving your own country, trying to do the best for your own country is absolutely fine, but it shouldn't be contradictory to loving the planet and loving humanity. Who decided that those two things were antagonistic? Who decided that nationalists and globalists should be enemies? It doesn't make any sense at all. Some people, like me, tend to care more about the whole system. Other people tend to care about their own place. Both are natural, both are human, both are fine. Let's work together. Why should we be enemies? It doesn't make any sense. I'm glad that there are nationalists looking after my own country because I'm not. They should be glad that I'm looking after the world because they're not looking after the world. What a ridiculous thing to say. But at least I'm interested in trying to get the world looked after. So, we jump forward. 2 months ago, a new country was born. Almost every year, somebody starts a new country. My co-founder, Madeline, and I started a new country 2 months ago. It's not a big deal. Although it is a strange thing, for the first time in my life, when I tell people what my job is, they think they haven't heard me, which is quite an interesting experience. They say, what do you do? And I say, I started a new country. And they say, you started a new company. I said, no, I started a new country. And there's a silence. And they say, you started a new country? How does that work? And so I tell them. Basically, it all started 4 years ago. I gave a TED talk in Berlin in which I complained about the state of the world in a slightly more articulate way than I have this morning. And lots of people afterwards started writing me emails saying that they also agreed with my position about the state of the world, and they also felt like me. They shared my fears, they shared my hopes, and I began to realize that maybe I wasn't alone after all, that there were obviously quite a large number of people around the world who shared both the fears and the hopes. And it was very exciting. I felt as if I was part of a family. And after I'd received about 20,000 emails from people all over the world, basically saying the same things, I started doing some research to try to find out how many people there were in the world who shared these views. And what I discovered was that there was a really large number. Actually, according to these statistics, it's about 10% of the world's population who are really totally committed to being citizens of the world first and citizens of their own nation, first equal, second, third, fifth, ninth, 27th, whatever it is. 10%. 10% of the world's population is an extraordinarily large number of people. It's about 760 million. So around the world, there are 760 million people, at least, who share the same hopes and fears that I talked about just now. That's almost like a country. 760 million? If that was a country, it would be the third largest country on the planet after India and China. It would be double the population of the United States of America. That would be a really powerful force that could maybe start driving some real change in the international community, start encouraging countries to work together more and really make these things work. And so, Madeline and I decided that we were going to try to contact those 760 million people wherever they live, introduce them to each other, and turn it into a country. Who says you can't do that? Who says you can't start a country if you feel like it? Nobody. Nobody has ever shown me a law or a regulation in the international community that says if you've got 760 million friends and you want to start a country together, you're not allowed to. So we're doing it. We've started introducing them to each other, and they all get on beautifully. They're very, very different, but they're motivated by many of the same hopes and fears, so they get on really, really well together. Within 48 hours after we'd started, we discovered that our citizens had already started coming from more than 150 countries. People from all over the world were joining up. And you can become a citizen too. It's very easy. You just go to the website. I'm going to tell you the website address. Are you ready? www.good.country. It's called the Good Country. And good.country is the place where you become a citizen. You do have to pay, right? It costs $5 a year. That's the tax bill for each citizen. And we need that because otherwise we won't be able to organize the thing, we won't be able to run it. We have no external funding. We never want any money in the system that comes from foundations or corporations or philanthropists or anybody else other than the citizens. So $5 each, I think, is a pretty reasonable tax rate to be able to fund the third largest country on the planet. And lots of people are signing up. And what we do is we collectively make policies. The reason for wanting to start a country is because a country can make and execute its own policies. It's not like the NGOs and the charities and the activist organizations I talked about before. The problem with them is that they have to try to influence the governments of other countries to behave in a certain way, and it's not very easy, and it often doesn't work. But if you are a country yourself, then you make your policies and you execute them yourself. And that's what we're going to do. Now, I can hear, I think, some of you worrying about the fact that we don't have any territory. And you're thinking, where is this country, right? Because people always do ask that. Well, the simple answer is we don't have any territory, and why would you want territory? Because territory is a nuisance. If you have territory, then you need an army to defend it, and we don't want to have an army. So we exist on the internet. It's a perfectly decent place to have a country. And anyway, by definition, all of our citizens already have somewhere to live, so they're not looking for a new physical home, but they are looking for a place in which they can explore their international identity. So I shall stop at this point, having just given you a taster of what the Good Country is all about. And I would just ask you one thing. Take a look at it and see what you think. If it turns out that you're somebody that shares some of my hopes and some of my fears, then you might just find that becoming a citizen of the good country is something that makes you feel a little bit more powerful in this scary world that we live in today. Thank you very much.